So part of what I love about this time of year is, and this is probably some projection, but I think there's also some truth to it, is that as much as we call the new year January, which I suppose it is, it seems to me that September is, for many of us, the start of the next year. Like really that Tuesday after Labor Day, there's this sense of like, oh yeah, I got to get back to work. I got to start working hard again. I got to get back to the gym. I got to start replenishing the savings account that I've spent the summer depleting, those kinds of things. And I think it's obviously especially true if you're in school or if your kids are in school or if you work in school. But it seems to me that it's also true just the way we live our lives in this community, that so much of our lives are built around the recreation that happens May through August, or sometimes the second week of July through the first week of August, however the weather works that year. And so there's this kind of deep breath and sense of like, okay, so we get back to routine. And so this year, rather than start a brand new series right out of the gates, what I want to do is spend these first couple weeks just kind of looking at what does it mean to be stepping into a new year and asking some questions about faith and how it is we move forward in all of that. You know, that there's this question that we've been asking for years, and I think it is suitable to ask again this morning, and that's this question of what if it's the daily that leads to the dream? And that's something that we've valued communally. It's something we've tried to value individually, where we just recognize that having a vision, having an ambition, wanting to accomplish something, wanting to be something, that's the easy part. It's super easy to just have this big idea, whether that big idea is your job or your health or your career or your faith or whatever. But it's another thing to translate that. It's another thing to make all of that happen in the everyday. And so we've just been asking this question, what if it's the daily that leads to the dream? I think John Maxwell summarizes that best. He talks about the rule of 5, and John Maxwell points out that if you had this giant 100-year-old tree in your backyard and you, rather than call an arborist, decided you were going to take it down yourself, and rather than use a chainsaw, you were going to use a medieval axe, that one approach would be to walk into your backyard and to just start swinging away. And maybe ignorantly believing that by the end of the day, the tree will fall and your neighbor's house will hopefully still be intact. But what's likely to happen is 40 minutes in, your hands are going to be bloody and blistered, and you're going to be more tired than you know was possible, and you won't be able to lift your arms above your head, and tomorrow you'll be walking like this. And you'll quit and you'll walk in and you'll sit on the couch and you'll figure out how you're going to find the money to hire a professional. But what the rule of 5 says is that the other option is to say, okay, it's going to take me 18 months to knock that tree over, but here's the plan. Every morning, I'm going to get up and I'm going to swing the axe 5 times at the tree, ideally. And every afternoon, I'm going to do the same thing. And initially, it's going to look like no progress is being made, but over time, I'm going to build skill and I'm going to build muscle, and slowly, the cumulative effect will begin to take place, and hopefully after a year or maybe 2, I'll knock that sucker over. And that's what we mean by the daily leads to the dream, is how do we translate the big stuff to the small stuff? And as much as I hope that is helpful for you to process in your everyday whatever life, this morning what I want to do is ask it around faith. Because faith is one of those things that if we're not careful, we just drift. You know, we have goals for our business and our savings accounts. We have goals for our own character sometimes. We have goals for the next vacation we're going to take or the next upgrade we're going to make in our favorite recreation. But as we've talked about in the past, drifting is something that happens in those areas that matter most. You don't drift towards a better marriage. You don't drift towards a better relationship with your kids. You don't drift towards those big, hairy, audacious goals. You don't drift towards a healthier relationship with God. Those are the types of things that if you're not careful, you drift away from them. But instead, if you're going to accomplish them, what we've talked about is you've got to turn upstream and make some specific decisions. And so this morning, I just want to ask, how do we do that? And what would that look like for you to be that intentional over these next few days and to project out over the next year and ask yourself, what are your faith goals? You know, a friend asked me, if you're wondering what this is all about, a friend asked me just before Labor Day, before we took off for the weekend ourselves, a friend said, Adam, what does type 2 starting over look like for you? And the reference, of course, is the series that we did in August. And if you weren't with us, there's always podcasts, and soon, thanks to Kate and Marla, videos and live feed and all that stuff, but there's not on that one. But if you want to look back, I recommend you do that. But by way of quick review, what we talked about in August is that there's a couple types of starting over that happen in life. One type is the type that's thrust upon us because of something like cancer, because of something like a change in the marketplace and our business fails. It's the type that happens when we get a divorce or someone fires us or the school year doesn't go well, and everything goes up in a ball of flames and we have to start over. But what we've spent August exploring is that there's another type of starting over, and that's what we've been calling type 2 starting over. It's one of my only original ideas ever in my whole life. And what type 2 starting over recognizes is this very disciplined practice of saying sometimes the type of starting over that's required is because of whatever success you've had. Sometimes everyone at work is patting you on the back and telling you you're the man and everything's going great. Sometimes there's certain things that are just going awesome and that creates a momentum, but then you recognize that that momentum is actually taking you off course. It's what a good organization does when they recognize, yeah, we're busier than ever, but our customer service stinks. It's what a great organization does when they go, yeah, more and more people are buying our product, but the expense is our product isn't as good as it used to be. It's what people do when they go, yeah, the guys at work sure like me, but my wife can't stand me anymore. And so we've just been asking this question, what does type 2 starting over look like? And I know that this intro is a giant amalgam. But sometimes you think about things so much that it gets too complicated and then you walk away from them for a couple weeks and the simplest answer is the 2-sentence answer. That's what happened to me as I was sitting with my friend and I said, I think for me it's permission to not have arrived. I think type 2 starting over for me is I never set out to be the authority on God or theology or church. The goal was never at 19 years old when I started following Jesus to have God figured out and be able to perfectly explain him and all of his complexity. I think for me it's permission to just have simple faith. And organizationally, that's kind of what we're doing. Well, I walked out of that meeting and I went into a webinar kind of conference thing with one of my profs at George Fox, or what is now called Portland Seminary, which I do not think is cool. It's too hipster. But she talked about visiting monasteries. I'm in a spiritual director's class, and what I didn't know is that it's fairly common at monasteries that the monks, the priests, the nuns, they drink out of double-handed glassware. And they do so in order to remind one another that they're still beginners. That despite all of their experience and the accolades and the years of following Jesus, there's this simple little gesture where they're constantly using double-handed glassware to remind themselves that they're all kids and none of them have God figured out, that we're all beginners, and somehow that's the most important thing. And so what I want to do this morning is ask that. What is the dream? Like, what's the goal? My boys and I have been getting to know this guy named Manny in town. Manny is from Venezuela, and he's one of the baseball authorities in town, or one of those guys who knows it really, really well. He played for the Helena Brewers and then grew roots here. And so Manny was telling us, it's probably been a month ago now, that when he was 12 years old, he decided he wanted to play Major League Baseball or professional baseball in the United States, which I suppose isn't lost on us how a 12-year-old boy in Venezuela would look up at that mountain and go, let's go do this. Well, the problem was, as a 12-year-old boy, he wasn't even a starter on his league team. But he was committed. He decided this is what he wanted. And so at 12 years old, he started going to practice every morning before school. And then after school, he went back to practice. And for over 4 years, every morning and every afternoon, he practiced baseball a couple times a day. Well, the international signing rules for Major League Baseball players is 16 years, 6 months. Unless you're the Yankees, then you find ways to do it earlier. Just kidding. That's a cheap shot. Yankees, Dodgers, I'm sure they all do it. 16 years, 6 months, you as a Major League team can sign these international players. They don't come out of the draft, obviously, and there's all these complexities now with signing money. So at 16 years, 6 months, he had his first tryout, and the answer was no. And then he had his second tryout, and the answer was no. And his third tryout, the answer was no. Fourth, fifth, sixth tryout, no, no, no. 7th, 8th, 9th tryout, still all no's. 10th tryout, no. Now what are there, 30 teams in Major League Baseball? He's a third of the way through. Still hasn't been signed. 11th team, no. 12th team, no. 13th team, no. 14th team, no. 15th team, the Milwaukee Brewers, finally signed him. And in that moment, I'm like, man, I hope my boys are paying attention because we don't play baseball because of baseball. We play baseball because the daily leads to the dream. To me, it's the ultimate illustration. You can have a goal. Everybody has the goal. The question is, how do you translate it down into the daily? And obviously, Manny is a guy who got that. He understood that. I don't know whether it was intuitive or someone helped him with that, but he understood it's going to take 4.5 years to knock the tree over. I commonly am sitting across from people who are disappointed with where their faith is at. And the struggle is it's just like a marriage or a friendship or any other relationship. You don't just solve that problem overnight. But here's the question. What's the dream for your faith? And how do you get there? Like, what's the point of this? What is your goal for your spirituality? And chances are high, if you're anything like me, that some of you have been following Jesus long enough that you haven't thought about that question. For you, the goal is to stay a follower of Jesus, which if your goal was anything else would be a terrible approach. I just want to stay on top. I just want to, no, you've got to have some active goals. What's the goal? Why are you here? Is it to arrive in heaven when you die? And I'm not even suggesting that would be a bad goal, but is that the goal? And if so, how do you work on that? Is it to avoid hell? Is it because you're an Enneagram 6 and you're a catastrophizer, and like me, you're a control freak, and the best thing to do with God is master him so it's one more variable eliminated from your life? Do you do theology and take God seriously because you're the type of person who likes to know more than the person next to you, and God is a pretty big topic in our culture? What's the goal? Is it to eliminate pain and suffering? I know for me at 19, I thought choosing to follow Jesus was choosing a life where bad things wouldn't happen. Is that the goal for you? Is it to make God smile? Is it the opposite, that what's impressed upon you is an unpleasable parent and to keep God from frowning at you? What's the goal? Jesus offers what I think is a pretty stern warning for all of us who sit in church on Sunday mornings. He talks about one particularly toxic goal in his great Sermon on the Mount. He says this, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. Verse 2, so when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. There's a theme to his warning. Verse 5, and when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Verse 16, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they're fasting. Jesus has a strong opinion on this one, and he says, hey, one of the goals, if you're not careful, becomes being seen by others as a spiritual giant. Don't do that, is really what he's saying in the entire chapter. What's the goal? And as I found myself asking this question over and over and over again these last several months, because I had some things happen to me last year that have never happened to me in my 20 years, where I would walk off the stage, not often, but a few times, and go, God, I'm just kind of sick of talking about you. And it causes you to ask this question, what is the point of this? Not that I'm sick of you, but just sick of all the ideas and layer upon layer upon layer. And I remember a friend saying to me decades ago, Adam, I could never go to church again and still not have enough life to apply everything I'm told to do every Sunday. What's the win? And I couldn't more genuinely say my goal this morning isn't to give it to you, but to beg you to create space in your life. And we're going to return to this next week before we start a series called Parented, where we're going to talk about parenting is difficult, but if we're being honest, being parented is even more difficult, and we want to kind of have an honest conversation about all that. But first, I want to spend a couple weeks going, what's the point of this? And for me, that question has brought me back to a moment in 2006 when I was in Dr. Delamarter, who you've met him. He spoke here before, if you've been around here for a while, spoke here a couple times. A moment in his Old Testament class where he took us back to the very first book of the Bible in one of the most simple verses in the Bible, and took a bunch of seminary, complicated God people and boiled it down to this one little tiny thing. But to do that, I think there's a context, and the context is important, and I'd like to illustrate it this way, and I didn't come up with this. I think a guy named Bruxy Carvey came up with this. We've done this before, but one way to talk about this is this two-chair thing, that in the beginning, God created. And I think it's essential we don't get caught up how, 6 days, or evolutionary creation. That's not crucial to the integrity of the story. In the beginning, this completely fulfilled, utterly content God who didn't need me or you or anything else created. Why? I don't know. Why'd you have kids? This God wanted to share his life. And he creates people. And as the story goes, he wanted partnership. He wanted collaboration. We were made to work, according to the text, and to work with and for and through him. And yet people, they turned their back on God. And they made life about them. They wanted to be God. They didn't trust God. And this point, I think, all of Christian theology, in my opinion, hinges on this point. What did God do at this point? Because you can tell a story that says at that point God turned his back, and until Jesus showed up and talked God into liking people again, that was the posture. But in my opinion, that's not the way the text tells the story. Where the text tells the story is God came to Adam and Eve, came to them in the garden and said, wait, why are you hiding? What has gone on here? And people did the same thing. They turned their back on God. And once bitten, what would God do? Well, God came to them again, and this time he came and he said, wait a minute. Sin is crouching at your door. It wants to destroy you. Something we're going to talk about in this parenting series is just the realization that we have to help our kids know that there's such a thing as evil that hates them. Tried to warn them. And people were like, we don't trust you, and they turned their back on God. And God again, after this momentary, like, maybe this was a bad idea, another diaper, God returned. Through guys like Noah and Enoch and other people, he kept coming back to people, and people kept turning their back on God. And then there's this guy named Abram. And God came to Abram. And he said to Abram, hey, Abram, here's the deal. I've created this arrangement where I do almost nothing without doing it through people. And I love this creation, and I love people, and I hate the mess that's been created. So here's the deal, Abram. I'm going to bless you, and you're going to bless everybody else. It's a reminder what it means to be a God-fearing, God-following, Jesus-following person. The basic understanding is God's means of blessing your neighbor, your teacher, your spouse, your kids isn't necessarily to directly do it himself, but to bless you, and you in turn do it for them. When you see that person next to you put a check in the bucket, that's the fundamental belief. God gives me some of his, and I use it to be an extension of his goodness to others. When you see someone ushering at the front door or running sound or any number of other things, that's why we do this. And Abram said, okay. And part of the arrangement was Abram had to go to this foreign land. And it just rather simply says he went. And then they were doing their thing, and Abram was in this land that's been conflict-free ever since. And all of a sudden it occurred to Abram that some of God's promises weren't coming true. Namely, he didn't have any kids. And he recognized, we're not getting any younger, and I think probably an heir of mine is going to be, or a slave of mine is going to be my heir. And to Abram's credit, and I think this is what we see in the Psalms, to Abram's credit, he didn't play religion. Somehow he communicated his angst to God. God, what the heck? What's going on here? And God came to him. And it says in verse 4, Then the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to them, so shall your offspring be. To which Abram said, God, I don't think you understand. We have a plumbing problem. That's not what he said at all. Verse 6, and here's this little simple place where probably the most educated theologian I've ever got to have audience with just wrecked the meaning of faith for me. Here it is, verse 6. It just simply says, Abram believed the Lord, and credit to him as righteous. Now, the second part of that verse is full of all kinds of mystery. I'm going to skip it. The first part, Abram believed the Lord. And here's the question. If all you had were the first 15 chapters of Genesis, if all you had was the book of Genesis to describe to yourself or your kids or your neighbor, what does it mean to believe God? How do you answer the question? Are we left to assume that what Abram understood was that he was this horrible sinner and that someday God would send his son, and because he believed that someday God would send his son, he could have a relationship with God? Is that the nature of Abram's faith? Remember, these are real oral stories, and there was a time when oral stories were thought to have more integrity than written stories. These are real oral stories that capture the real faith of real people like you and I who dealt with real disease and real challenges. And the high point in one of their oral traditions was this moment where Abram believed the Lord. What does that mean? Does that mean that he had all the right moral answers, that he knew which person to vote for and what the right moral answers were to all of life's complexities? Does that mean he had this complex understanding of the Trinity? Does it mean that he had a great understanding of world religions and the implications of that on everybody else? What does it mean that he believed God? And the word that was introduced to me over 10 years ago was one simple word. It's fidelity. Like, if we're getting literal, the description here is one of trust. And trust, in many cases, was in spite of what Abram knew or didn't know about God. He trusted God. We see evidence of that. He left his own homeland and went to another one. He trusted God. And here he was at this moment in his life where everything that he thought God was going to do wasn't happening, and God reassured him, and he trusted God. What does that mean? Does it mean that he assumes that nothing bad will ever happen again? Does it mean that he assumes that life will be easy? Or does it mean that more than any other thing, any other being on the planet, he was going to be vulnerable to somebody and he was choosing this Yahweh, this God? What if the danger of this is we make faith about more than a series of disciplines designed to teach us to rely upon the character of God? Scott McKnight points out, you read the Gospels and you can't help but like Jesus. They're not about a system. They're about a God who compels us to trust him. So let me ask you, what are your goals? And what are the things that you do every day that aren't designed to make you better? They're not there to make you a better person. They're there to help you trust God. The scripture reading, the attending church, the throwing money in a bucket, the serving, the getting baptized, they're all valuable only to the degree that they what? That they remind ourselves to trust God. Why are those daily returns to God so important? Because God needs us to know more about him in order for us to have faith in him? That's where it gets tricky. The knowledge is about confidence. You see this play itself out. You interact with people, and the more you get to know them, the less you trust them. And then you interact with people that the more you interact with them, the more you trust them. The goal of all of it is that, isn't it? You know, I've been living in Psalm 23 these last couple months. I think we're going to do a series from it in January. But it's quite a remarkable text. We're going to go to 4 in just a second. It starts, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing, which is, you could spend a month on that because it's such an incongruent, audacious claim. Because then you walk out the door and you're diagnosed with cancer. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Sheep don't lie down unless they're full, I'm told. He leads me beside quiet waters. Sheep prefer a pond over a stream. He refreshes my soul. And then it's verse 4 that I think, again, the simplicity of David's faith. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Here's what I'm loving about Psalm 23 and the advanced nature of David's faith. It's childlike in the sense that he's going, this God can do anything. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. And yet, it's not simplistic in the sense that he's not assuming that means there won't be dark times, even though I walk through the valley. He's not assuming that trusting God means bad things don't happen. In fact, what he's assuming is kind of the opposite. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. It's a lot like Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount where he says, man, if you do this trust in me thing right, you'll arrive at this place where your house is built on the rock and the storms will come is the assumption. But the house will stand. What's the house? This is the house. So let me ask you, looking back at the last year, what were the places, what were the times, what were the circumstances that caused your faith to waver? And therefore, what's the weightlifting regimen that you can do every day between now and this time next year and put yourself back in some situations where you can see whether or not you've grown in your capacity to do this? not to avoid suffering, not to be simplistic and naive in the face of it, not to be trite and religious, but to have that Kelsey-like experience where in the midst of suffering, you're like, but this is okay because God is here. So let me ask you, what are your goals for faith this year? And next week, especially for those of you that aren't even sure if you have faith and what you're supposed to do with that, the question I want to ask next week is, do you have to start with the question, do you even want faith? But what are the tangible daily things? Maybe for you, this just reinvigorates why you get out of bed in the morning. Maybe for you, this is a reminder of why that's valuable to get out of bed in the morning and spend some time in Scripture. Maybe you need to introduce some new disciplines. Maybe there's some relationships there. You know, the key word of the Old Testament is remember, 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 remember. The implication being what? God was there yesterday. Did you see him? It's like that statement, we don't learn from experience. That's the biggest myth in the world. We learn from reflected upon experience. Why are the people in the Old Testament constantly building these towers and doing these weird things? See, here's permission for your next tattoo. Because they needed reminders that God was faithful. You know, so much of the design of what we worked on this summer is to go, let's just get it back to this. We weren't trying to be the only church in town. We're not trying to be the best church in town. We're not trying to have God figured out. We're just trying to be a community that is learning together what it looks like to trust God. And then to put a towel over our arm and just serve people. And the whole thing is predicated upon us winning together as well as individually. So would you take some moments today, maybe even during this next song, maybe tomorrow morning, what you have goals for your business, you have goals for your savings account, you have goals for your kids, you have goals for the next thing you're going to fix on your house. What are your goals for your faith? Identify the circumstances that would test whether or not you grow this next year. I'd like to pray, God. Thanks, Lord, that you are vast and infinite and you really do have no end. Thanks, God, that we don't have to understand you, that we have the opportunity to learn to trust you. And God, we pray that we'd be a people who pursue a kind of faith that's empathetic and kind, but also convicted and deep. That those moments that your Holy Spirit is in our lives are apparent to us. And God, for those of us that type of language just alienates because we've tried and we just don't have that, would you point us to the relationships and the moves that we can make that would help us bridge some gaps? We love you. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.